Good afternoon. My name is Andrew King-Reese, and I am the chair of the American Bar Association Commission on Sexual and Domestic Violence. Appreciate you all being here today. We are thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled Report from the Field, Domestic Violence Survivors and the Impact of COVID-19. Sponsored by the Commission, the Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the American Bar Association Judicial Division. This panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars on the COVID-19 pandemic. We are actively planning additional programming on COVID, so please visit the AmericanBarAssociation.org for updates on those programs. We are very fortunate today to have an impressive panel. As an attendee, I want to cover just a couple of sort of procedural matters. You should see a control panel with controls such as audio options, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. For the purposes of this webinar, we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A and not the chat function. If you do not see those controls, please ensure your screen is not idle. And there are a couple different times in the program that we'll be trying to address some of those questions. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who's registered so you can share it widely with your networks. Please feel free to leave us feedback or ask questions to follow up. Today we have a wonderful group of panelists representing a wide range of perspectives from the bench and the bar, civil and criminal practitioners. We're focusing on the legal perspective to the impact of COVID-19 on domestic violence survivors. I anticipate we have survivors and survivor service providers on the call today. We look forward to hearing from these perspectives, particularly in our Q&A opportunities. I would like to note, as you all know, this is a challenging time for service providers, judges, courts, and attorneys, as we all work try to figure out how to continue addressing the legal needs of domestic violence survivors, even in the face of the pandemic. Now, of course, obviously, it goes without saying, this is a particularly challenging time for survivors due to the impact of shelter-in-place orders, restricting movement, and limiting options for seeking safety. So please note that the DV hotlines are open, and we've put some information in the chat box or in the Q&A for folks who would like more support or other options that they can pursue that. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. We're very fortunate to have Kelly Berry, the director of the UC Davis Family Protection and Legal Assistance Clinic at the University of California, Davis School of Law. Judge Bernadette de Souza, judge of the Orleans Parish Civil District Court in Louisiana, and also president of the National Association of Women Judges. Rebecca Henry, deputy chief counsel of the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. Mari Carmen Garza, group coordinator, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid's Victim Rights Group, and also the director of the Legal Alliance for Survivors of Sexual Assault Project. David Martin, senior deputy prosecutor at King County Prosecutor's Office in King County, Washington, supervisor of the King County Prosecutor's Office Domestic Violence Unit, and co-manager of the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Unit. And we also have Deepti Padiki Smith, director of advocacy at Legal Services of Northern Virginia. So as I said, we have a great variety of perspectives, civil, criminal, bench, and bar. We're very fortunate today to have all of our panelists joining us. Now, we're going to kick off with asking each panelist their thoughts on some of the challenges they are facing, current ways to address those challenges, and any tips or lessons they've learned from this. So I'm going to say 5 to 10 minutes roughly each, and then we'll move to another panelist. So let's start, if Judge de Souza, if you're available, let's start with your perspective from the bench.
Hi, Andrew. I just wanted to mention that Judy Perry Martinez is on to give her introduction.
Okay.
Perfect. Then, I'm sorry, Judge Souza, before we get there, I would like to welcome the President of the American Bar Association, Judy Perry Martinez. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and to all the panelists, including my dear friend, Judge Souza, who will allow me to take a few moments of time from all of you in this important program. So welcome to this ABA webinar on domestic violence and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on families and women and others who are victims of domestic violence. I'm grateful to Andrew and to the commission, its staff, and so many who have worked hard along with the sponsors that are joining the Commission on Sexual and Domestic Violence to put on this program. It is one of the several webinars that the ABA is sponsoring in response to the legal challenges that are facing us as a result of the pandemic. And what I know that many on this call already know is that the ABA has long been a champion of for domestic violence survivors and for the laws that are needed in order to protect them and their families. I can tell you as a former chair of the Commission on Domestic Violence that I know that there is an imperative to our keeping at our best in making sure that we are addressing these issues through our policies as well as educational programs like this one. And in the wake of the pandemic, we quickly stood up an ABA task force on legal needs arising out of the 2020 pandemic. And it is a convening of so many ABA entities, as well as organizations outside of the ABA, the Conference of Chief Justices, the National Center for State Courts, and the National Legal Aid and Defender Organization, LSC, and so many more who have come together to unify and talk about and work to mobilize pro bono resources as we identify legal needs. And the resources that are there that are being collected on a daily basis are available to all of you at www.ambar.org/coronavirus task force. And we realize that the stressors are so many on domestic violence victims and that the pandemic is placing so many more that they're having to deal with day in and day out. And we know it's affected communities across our nation and the world. But I would suggest to you, no community is being harder hit and more vulnerable than those at this moment who are domestic violence survivors, who were ordered to stay home with their abusers, and they are seeking legal assistance. We know the claims and the needs will only grow, and they're doing so with the court systems that are often struggling themselves, trying to have what they can have in terms of proceedings, overwhelmed police departments and jails trying to release inmates and trying to make right decisions there, and all of that can be of concern to domestic violence victims. So this webinar will, I know, with this expert panel, address many of those issues and more. And this panel, many of them are very well known to me, and I just applaud them from taking time from their duties and so much of the work they're doing on the home front in order to share their knowledge and expertise with all of us here today. You know, this is a historic chapter for the American Bar, for our legal profession, for our justice system, and frankly, for our nation. And knowing that all of you who have gathered for this webinar are a part of that gives great confidence to, I think, all of us in this room, this virtual room, to understand so much of the work that has to be done and that we'll get it done. If you're not a part of the ABA community, I urge you to join us. If you are, I thank you. But most importantly, thank you for your leadership and thank you for your service to those in need. And Andrew, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, President Perry Martinez. I appreciate you joining in, and I really appreciate your leadership here. I know this has been a very unusual presidential year, and it's been impressive to watch you rise to it and to lead the ABA and have the ABA be a source for other places and other state bars, other countries really looking to us to say, how are we doing it? And I really appreciate your leadership on that. I'd like to now go to Judge Souza and hear your input and your perspective on how it's going in the courts and on the bench.
Good afternoon. As you all know, this has been very challenging, more importantly for family courts around the country that handle domestic violence cases. I am a judge of the civil jurisdiction, general jurisdiction court, dedicated to handling domestic violence cases and family law matters. The way we have really worked the situation out is we are very fortunate to have the New Orleans Family Justice Center. It's an agency that receives calls from victims of abuse. And then they take those calls, and we have a coordinator that generally was set at our courthouse, is now working remotely from home. And she'll place a call to the victims and take all the information from them, and then attempt to file electronically through Southeast Louisiana Legal Services lawyers at the civil court. The civil court have made a decision to have a duty judge at all times during the week at the courthouse on site. And so every TRO, restraining order, is signed by the duty judge. The copy is either emailed to the Family Justice Center or the attorney that is filing, e-filing the matter. And then a copy goes out to the civil sheriff's office for defendants to be served. The way we are handling the hearings we are attempting to do it remotely. For now, we have all the temporary restraining orders previously that were granted are in place until May 8th by the order of the chief judge at the civil court. And furthermore, the Supreme Court order has suspended all non-essential matters except in emergency cases. And so that's why we thought it fit, in order to prevent people from coming to the courthouse for their hearing, is to extend the restraining orders until May 8th. Now, our governor of Louisiana has extended the order, the stay-at-home order, to May 15th, which means that we either decide to extend the ones that we had already set past May 8th, to handle through remote hearing. The order from the Supreme Court allows us to hold remote hearings so long as the parties consent to them. And if one objects, then we have to have a hearing to make sure that the refusing to participate through remote hearing was unreasonable. So that's where we are with those hearings. As you know, there is a great, the spike of DV cases all around the country has also affected New Orleans. Victims are forced to stay home. There's a scarcity of shelters where they can go to. And so this is the best method, is for them to know that they have the Family Justice Center that they can call and proceed in filing a petition, or come to the courthouse. And we do have the deputies that put them through and give them the forms, and they go up to the clerk's office and file it, and they get service immediately as soon as they are at the courthouse. So that's where we are. In the future, we hope to there's going to be an overload of cases because we've continued matters since March, all of April, and now the first week in May. So the hope is to try and do some remote hearings, if possible, starting May 4th, which I was originally scheduled to begin to be in court with a limited staff at the courthouse. So that's and using the necessary precautionary measures if we do have to have in-person hearing.
Judge, can I just ask you a follow-up to that?
Sure.
So a lot of this is taking place really on the local level, right?
Yes.
Almost county by county or
Yes.
courthouse by courthouse. So two parts of that is how are you communicating county by county or courthouse by courthouse? How is that collaboration taking place? And then are there things that you would say are going beyond sort of the local question, which is more like, how is that going to apply nationally? Are there any of those things out there that you're encountering or seeing?
Well, the way we are handling it throughout the state is very recently that we have a Louisiana District Judges Association. And so very recently through the Supreme Court, I was able to host a roundtable discussion of all the family court judges statewide. And we basically learned from that of what the judges were doing. Say, for instance, in Baton Rouge and Lafayette and Monroe, the various parishes, as we call them in Louisiana. And so we're just going from, parish through parish, and we are getting a sense of which jurisdiction is up and running and which cannot. The reason why the governor has extended our order because the number of cases in Monroe and Baton Rouge are increasing. And so that's why there is the reluctance to really go to court. And moreover, with the extension of the stay away order, the stay at home order by our mayor of New Orleans, there's a great likelihood that sometimes either the petitioner or defendant may not come to court, even if, or may not, and so that's one way of handling it. The other way, in terms of, like I mentioned during our practice session, was the fact that it's my hope, even in the future, is to have, if we're going to practice social distancing and limited number of people in the courtroom, because generally on any given day in a family court, you have wall-to-wall people in the courtroom because it's the highest docket of cases. And so it's my hope that we'll have an isolated room where there'll be computers set up, and then we could do some by Zoom hearing to alleviate the number of people in the courtroom. In terms of nationally, I am staying in touch by participating with the Judicial Engagement Network of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. So I'm constantly on webinars. And now, as president of National Association of Women Judges, we are going to kick off a bunch of webinars as well. So that's how I hope to bring what I learned nationally back to Louisiana. And so eventually we'll develop best practices for every court in the country, so we are better prepared. Like I say, in the past, we've gone through this in terms of delivery of services and legal services as a result of Hurricane Katrina. We had pre-Katrina way of doing things with domestic violence victim, and post-Katrina is how we worked in a very collaborative way with agencies and legal services and courts and public advocates and prosecutors and and defense attorneys. And so that's how we've created various ways of collaboratively confront the issues as they come. And so it's my hope that post-COVID that we will have something in place. For instance, as a former legal services lawyer, through the ABA, generous donation from the ABA, we had a disaster relief manual that was subsequently used by other disaster-related places. And so it's our hope that somewhere down the line, we can possibly put a manual together as what do we do with remote hearings and how do we conduct them and things of that nature.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It does feel like we should be able to, at some point, have sort of a best practices for remote hearings or other situations dealing with similar types of situations. Hopefully we don't see anything like this again for some time, but thank you, appreciate that. Let's turn to David Martin in here, sort of from the criminal side. David, what are you seeing out there on the criminal side, both sort of locally, but also issues of import on the national scene?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to attempt to do a quick PowerPoint here. We'll see how this goes, and talk about a few things. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Yeah, I'm from Seattle, from King County, Washington. Seattle's one of 39 cities that we have in King County, and so we're a fairly good-sized jurisdiction. And there is a rise in domestic violence. I know that a lot of places around the country on the criminal side is seeing this. There's a spike in calls for service. This has been seen globally. My largest local police department, Seattle Police Department, has a 20% increase in calls for service. And then my unit manages all felony prosecution in King County, and we are at a multi-year high, 20% increase above average. And there's a lot of extreme violence going on, and our workloads have increased in number and intensity, and we're seeing a lot of challenges from victims. Resources are scarce. Things are very difficult. There's more violence and there's more guns. We also are fortunate that we do a lot of different things. We don't just do felony prosecution. We've had a long-standing protection order advocacy program, and are serving thousands of survivors in King County with those services. And that had to change because that was an in-person service. So what we have done in King County, and I know a lot of places around the country are doing this, is moving to remote protection order access. The thing that was most important for us to try and flatten the curve of increases in domestic violence, just because people are home more together, there's more opportunity, there's more substance abuse, there's more of other things going on. We wanted protection orders to be available. And so joining technology with our victims advocates, and then seeing all the things that flow from that. We worked very hard with our local police departments to establish e-service. Departments were refusing to do in-person service in our jurisdiction and across our state. And so we worked to do e-service. We have a firearms surrender protocol in Washington that's fairly robust. We moved that all to be remote. We're amicus to our court on that. We've had a long-standing partnership with Civil Legal Aid, and we've expanded that. And I think the remote technology has really allowed us then to expand access into pro bono. It's a lot easier for attorneys in my jurisdiction to spend a half an hour appearing remotely in a case, as opposed to showing up down to the courthouse and taking all day. We have our local law schools also doing virtual clinics. And on the criminal side of things, victims are able to call into the court and address the court when they have issues. And that's been a real benefit to the criminal court process, which is almost exclusively remote now. So our partnership, fortunately, in the months before COVID hit, we had been working on a remote protection order platform with a local startup in King County called Legal Atoms. This is it, and you can go check it out. And then the e-service of protection orders was something that flowed from this. We're fortunate that Washington's governor has allowed for this practice by proclamation recently, suspended our statutes. And there's a lot of things that you can do with e-service, which is really efficient, has been a real improvement in practice. I don't think there's anything magical about police officers driving around my jurisdiction and serving people with pieces of paper. You can do that just as effectively electronically, either by phone or text or email. We've had a lot of success doing it. And I think that's something that is a silver lining coming out of this practice. In addition, our firearms review aspect has been maintained. And so now that law enforcement is not just kind of serving orders personally, but reserving personal service for cases that involve firearms and orders to surrender of firearms, we're continuing to have success. This is a recent case that we dealt with. Law enforcement serving an order to surrender weapons. Individual had a gun safe. They weren't supposed to have a gun safe. They had a lot of guns in the safe. They weren't supposed to have any guns. And so this had a real improvement on our response. And so I think there are silver linings in all of this. The criminal cases are increasing, but there's been a real spirit of working collectively and collaboratively in King County to make sure that we're working with our courts to work out all the bugs in remote protection order process, and that we can e-file and do that. And I'm hoping that's something that will be maintained as we go forward. E-service, the firearms component, you can do that remotely, better partnership with pro bono. We're trying to find the positives in all of this, because I do think there are things that that need to change. They've needed to change for a long time, and now with this pandemic, we have an intense motivation to do so. So that's kind of what's going on in King County, and those increases I know from my colleagues in the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, who I work with across the nation. People are seeing an increase in domestic violence and really working to figure out, how are we going to respond? How are we going to make a difference here? And how are we going to kind of flatten the curve of domestic violence that's happening? And a key part of that, again, is protection order access. So Andrew, that's what I've got on the criminal side.
That's great. Thank you, David. And you said that e-filing came from a proclamation by the governor?
Yeah, it's something actually we did in advance, because local law enforcement was struggling. They're like, well, we can't do personal service right now. We have a lot that's going on. And so really, Seattle Police Department had a couple of detectives. They were trying to serve an order at a home, which the individual had COVID. They're like, well, we can't go in. So we just texted them the order. We screenshotted the text. They said they got it. We talked to them on the phone. They said they understood the order, and that's what we put in the return of service. And then they asked us, is that fine? And we're like, yeah, I mean, it seems fine. It doesn't meet the civil statute, which requires personal service. But interestingly, in Washington State, I don't need to prove personal service as a part of my criminal prosecution. I have to prove knowledge of the order. And the way that was done in the past, of course, is service by mail, right, or by publication, which are both really antiquated and not effective means of conveying service in this day and age. I mean, who does service by publication? It's ridiculous. So again, texting them and doing this is something that law enforcement can do quickly. They can do it effectively. It allows them to do other aspects of their job and then reserve those times for doing removals or doing firearm surrender.
And do you anticipate, I mean, is the governor's proclamation going to retire at some point, or will you need to replace it with some kind of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is we're fortunate, and I'm happy to share the governor's proclamation. We're lucky to be able to contribute to it. It has a lot of really good information that I think is a blueprint, at least in Washington State, about how we can address and make the system more effective going forward. When it ends, we're going to have to go back to personal service, but I think we'll see some of these orders stay in place, and we'll see a gradual response, hopefully to go back to normal at some point. But all of this is going to be a part of legislation in the future in Washington.
And we're seeing a lot of questions from folks about the lack of access to technology and what is the impact of that? Because you're talking about here's a way to get a protection order online and those types of services that ultimately have they create more opportunities for people to get help, but they also potentially down the road create the risk that the actual attorneys or service providers would go away because they're more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those are real concerns. I think greater access is critical for everything. It is unfortunate that most of the e-access across the country has been reserved for private litigation and private law firms. There's a disparity there. There's an inequity in how we provide e-access. I can say that I'm fortunate in that our protection orders all have advocates who are working with survivors to help them through that process. We've had this program for 3 decades. So if people don't have access to a computer, they can call us up, they can talk to us on the phone, we'll fill out the order for them, we'll figure out a way to get it to them. The courts have been accepting e-signatures and other forms of verification. But I think understanding the limitations of that means you need to be able to provide options for people. All those options have to be connected to advocacy of some way, shape, or form. And the important part about those intersections, though, is being able to triage, right? How do we navigate the person who needs to have an advocate do the work that they need to do? How do we then connect them to a legal aid attorney? How do we then connect them to pro bono counsel and navigate those things? With technology, it's pretty easy to set up algorithms. I know that sounds crazy, but ways to navigate people to make their opportunities, better. So I think these are amazing things. They have a lot of issues with them, but they're a huge advancement over people spending their entire day waiting to get a case number to go get their protection order when they could barely afford. They can't take time off from work. That's not who we're dealing with. So I think that this is a huge step forward, equity-wise, more than anything. It's not perfect though.
Excellent. Thank you, David, very much. Now let's hear from the civil practitioners. I think we'll sort of follow the sun and move from east to west. And so we'll start in Virginia with Deepti. What are you experiencing there?
Thank you. We have a similar order as previously, home order until June 10th. Our emergency lasts until May 17th for our court cases. Emergency still can go forward, and protective order cases are considered emergency cases. Our local courts have their own orders, which can add to some confusion, especially to pro se indigent parties. There are several areas we're working on, including remote hearings, outreach, protective orders, and just addressing visitation issues and some financial and shelter issues, including the housing and stimulus payments. With regard to remote hearings, we were in the process early on. Each jurisdiction has a different process. We reached out to chief judges. We learned about the court's infrastructure, their equipment, their availability to provide secure hearings, to help us develop programs. So we were part of local committees, and our voice, as a lot of the questions posed was asking how are we going to provide access to indigent clients that don't have access to technology. And up until I think yesterday, that's still something we're working on. And most recently in one of our committees, the court is trying to develop Wi-Fi in the courthouse. We've also explored eventually get have areas in the courthouse to distancing and stagger the cases so that there are not a lot of lists present, and hopefully when individuals are in the courthouse we can still maintain a safe environment for everybody. There's always the question of how do you provide access remotely, and there was discussion of community centers or other county or government agencies that may be able to provide these services. In one of our jurisdictions, the libraries give free Wi-Fi so if they're not open to the public. So it's sort of utilizing these places that are not, where people aren't going right now may be an option as well. In terms of the actual hearings, there's just other barriers. And I did fail to mention one other option we thought of was the DV offices in our office, because everybody's working remotely. And so setting up our conference room, our big conference room in a way so at least 2 people can be present, or having people in different offices, and just use 2-3 offices as places to hold hearings from. In terms of actual hearing, I think the courts are trying different courts using different technology, so it's learning the technology and trying to hold this hearing it's going to be a challenge. For example, if you want to talk to your client, depending on your platform, you're going to have to ask all the attendees to mute perhaps, so that you can talk to your client. You may have a platform where you can go to a different room so that you can talk to your client. So I think learning about the programs that your courts are using is going to be important. If there's interpreters involved, going to have consecutive translation because everybody is going to be on the screen. After one person talks, there's going to be a translation, and then it's going to go back to the person. So I think in terms of time, it's going to, I feel like we generally double time if there are translators involved, and this may be a little more. We definitely advise folks to add an extra 15 minutes or 20 minutes in the beginning to account for technology issues. Best practices: contact the court before the hearing, send copies of exhibits before the hearing. And the one thing that still we haven't quite figured out is evidence presentation, like documents, and and a lot of this sort of changing our structure of how we handle case. In the past, somebody has a court date, we know this is a case, we'll go. Now it's really betting a case, and proper pre-planning is definitely necessary. And so trying to, and so I think for each, it's factual, and case by case it's different, but trying to figure out what you might need is going to be important. For example, for impeachment, if you want to introduce a document that you hadn't anticipated, what are you going to do at that point? And I think asking all those questions to your clerk's office before you have the hearing is important, because calling them and saying, hey, this might happen, how can I do that during the hearing? So I think laying out all the foundation and the logistics beforehand would be very helpful. In terms of our outreach, our local jurisdictions have a coordinated response. It varies between the jurisdictions, but the partners are in regular communications, and they want to make sure social services needs are being met. And we're trying to sort of develop a messaging as to why DV is important during this public health crisis, because that also may assist with funding, which ultimately may buy this technology, or sort of other barriers we're identifying. There's also, as everyone mentioned, challenge to reaching individual victims. We also have to think about our elderly victims who are isolated and might not even have access to technology. We also are thinking about, generally there are racial disparities that exist in intimate partner violence among women of color, and they may have a historical distrust of law enforcement and a fear of deportation. And now I think the isolation is worsening that fear. And so we are really trying to think of innovative ways to do outreach. So for example, we want to host a webinar in the coming week that focuses on DV in the Black community. We want to go on Spanish radio and give our number and let people know where they can go for help. Because I think while we're focusing on sort of helping, this whole public health crisis just highlighted the lack of access there is. And I think just the barrier here is to say, call this number for help, because I can't physically go, or I can't physically see you to give this information. And I think someone had asked a question about, when police don't make arrests, and I think they're not, because right now, everyone's sort of in home. So I think this other additional outreach has to happen where we can address it without sort of reliance on traditional ways victims come to us, which include through law enforcement. In terms of outreach, we're also doing outreach to shelters. I think there was a question about what shelters are doing around our area. They do say they're promoting social distancing, and a number of our jurisdictions, because of the limited space, are moving clients to hotels. Our biggest sort of question on the phone is about custody and visitation. Many of the requests involved in or trying to get advice with regard to visitation. They want to comply with visitation requests. There may be an order, they may be an order, but one parent doesn't want to send a child for visitation. The other parent is now practicing social distancing. One parent doesn't want to send a kid because the other parent is a frontline worker. And so it's a lot of advice about the importance of co-parenting COVID with keeping in mind sort of the dynamics of, domestic violence. And we walk through and try to understand what qualifies as an emergency, what is reasonable, when is virtual visitation acceptable. There's you can have virtual visitation, but then there's also concern if you want to keep yourself safe. Can I change my background? I don't want to identify where I am. And so it's talking to clients. Again, it's so fact specific because you want to make sure safety is first and then try to see how you can comply with orders. I will say, the lessons just with custody visitation, it's definitely client safety. Where are you? Are you in a safe place to talk? Can we have a confidential conversation because everyone's at home? And so you want to ensure that is occurring, because we did have a case where that wasn't occurring and the victim didn't identify that until later in the conversation. And so it was sort of like that should be one of the first questions. I think sort of a learning lesson for us is definitely more intense case vetting. We can't assist everyone because we just can't go to court. So it's exploring sort of other ways. As I mentioned, protective orders, we're still handling them. We are going to court because the remote hearings aren't up and running. They just started sending out orders stating you can request remote hearings. And before we sort of take a case, we talk to the attorney, we talk to the client just to explore how they're feeling, their health, because we don't want to expose either of them to the courthouse if they're sick as well. And then we do go to hearings. Most recently, one of our attorneys had a case where the abuser filed a protective order against the victim. And so we had to go in immediately so that she had the ability to just get back her kids because he had the kids. And so these emergencies are still occurring. I think there was a question about lack of legal aid resources. Are you all taking cases? We are taking cases. However, it's on a very limited basis after we vet the cases. And I will say in many of the cases that have been involved where we thought we may take, I think of the current public health crisis, especially if there's an opposing counsel involved, everybody is trying to resolve it before they go to court. So I think there are sort of those exceptional times you will go to court. I most recently, one of our attorneys just went to court, I believe, to enter an order, and she had indicated everybody just had a mask on. They entered the order and they left the courtroom. It's just a few other issues. Housing is sort of an important issue now. A lot of we're getting calls where people are asking who can stay in the apartment, how can I get on the lease? And it's important to counsel victims through because protective order might not be the course. And so I think having that hard conversation and then finding solutions so that they don't have to be in that situation is going to be important. And a lot of that is connecting with the social services networks in your area. Because they're just, and the challenge is lack of housing options. And I just don't think there's, an easy solution to that issue. And finally, we do have a tax clinic, and with the stimulus money, we know that abusers may block the funds that people are getting. If you're separated, it's who receives the funds. Is it marital property? The funds may go to the last bank account or the last address. And so if the husband, we did have a case where recently the husband filed taxes without the wife's knowledge or her signature, used his bank account. And so it's trying to assist victims in getting that money back. And, the IRS right now said they're not going to assist. You're going to have to go through your local courts. And so these are, I would say, these are definitely a lot of challenges, but I think the silver lining, we internally, we have a veterans program and a reentry program, and we generally provide a legal checkup for those individuals. But with the current public health crisis, we are trying to implement that throughout our program. So for every victim that calls that we help with visitation, we want to create another case and talk to them about housing. We want to create another case and talk to them about unemployment. Because and we kind of have the time a little more now because we're not going to court as often. Very helpful for victims to get a holistic picture of what they can do, and I think just empower them more, because it whole situation sort of makes it seem like things are out of your control, and I think this will arm individuals with information. I will say, I think the other positive is people that might not have qualified are qualifying now. So this is silver lining. That's not the positive, but it's just that so many people are facing these barriers and understanding challenges that I feel like this experience is on a broader level, and so all levels of government and community are working together and building new networks and new infrastructures, which I think are being developed to help promote access, which I think will be helpful once we start coming out of this health crisis. And I will say, just so going forward, our office has started to look at what we're going to do when the courts reopen a little bit and then they go open fully, because it's going to be influx of cases, especially probably with visitation and court or other violations that weren't deemed as an emergency. And I think it's sort of staying ahead and trying to address that need is going to be important.
Deepti, thank you very much for that. Very, lots of great information there, and lots of really detailed tips and approaches, and some big picture questions as well. Thank you. That's fabulous. Mari Carmen, can you give us the picture in Texas and kind of what's happening there?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. Well, in Texas, and a lot of the things that have been mentioned before are already happening in Texas: emergency orders, Zoom hearings. I want to talk a little bit first about some of the special vantage point that we have at our organization in working with domestic violence and rape crisis centers, because as Deepti mentioned, and I think one of the questions that came up during this presentation is that what are shelters doing in response to this pandemic? And social distancing has been an issue. And of course, all of our partners had to shift as well into making sure that people who are seeking refuge at their shelters were safe, their staff was safe. So there was a process there until they got adjusted. I have checked in with many of our partners, and they're already operational and able to receive victims that need their assistance, but they have had to limit the number of people who can access their services to make it safe for everyone. So this option of using hotels as an alternative is still there. They mentioned that they are all getting an increase in calls, over 20%, 15 to 20% of calls, and that many of the individuals who are calling may not be ready to go into shelter because they're worried about their own safety, that they may contract the disease, because they may not be able to leave their abuser safely. So we know that those cases are still out there, and later will be an influx of more cases that will actually result in legal cases for us. The other thing that was really interesting as I was speaking to our partners was that although the calls for domestic violence are going up, they're seeing a decrease in sexual assault calls to their hotlines. And it is not that it's not occurring, but there are many issues possibly that we will see after the fact. I know that victim advocates accompany survivors to the hospitals for their sane accompaniment, but because of the limitations at the hospitals of how many people can go, that is not happening in person anymore. So there's a decrease, and there's also speculation if that's the reason, or also do victims not want to go get sane exams because they do not want to go into a hospital. So I think that the number of cases of sexual assault that we are seeing right now is not going to be accurate, and that we're not getting any of those calls for help in the legal setting either. That said, I was really pleased to see everything that they're doing and how they're preparing, not just after this pandemic, but future disasters. Some of them who had gone through Hurricane Harvey were already ready to address some of these issues, but some of our smaller organizations, more urban or less, more rural, had other issues just adjusting for this situation. So we continue to work with them and getting referrals. We have also at TRLA seen an increase of number of applicants that are coming in that identify domestic violence as an issue. From last year in April, from April 1st to April 28th, we had a total of 519 applications for legal services that identified the issue, one of the issues being domestic violence. During the same time period in 2020, just in April, we saw 630 applications. That's a 21% increase in people requesting services who identify domestic violence or some kind of victimization as a big issue. 81% to 82% of those cases are in the area of family law or requests for protective orders or crime victims compensation assistance. So 80% of those are being handled primarily by our family law team. There's housing, there's consumer issues, there's education. We see a spike on individuals who are asking questions about the stimulus package. And so all of those issues have to be addressed for a victim, and we need to be really cognizant, but the family law attorneys are really taking the brunt of all of those cases. And I know Dipke also talked about, our limitations. There are limited resources, as there is. I will be sharing a link in the chat box because we are looking for pro bono attorneys. So if there are attorneys who are listening to this webinar and want to participate or say, I want to help, I'll provide the link. And if you're able to do that, you can apply to become one of our volunteer attorneys, because that will help us be able to do a better job in responding to this crisis now and in the future, because we know that those cases are going to go up much more as this progresses. We're having also other issues related to remote hearings. I know technology has been an issue already, and it's not just going to the hearing, but preparing with our clients also is really important that we have that technology. One of our consumer attorneys recently had to work with a survivor, and I'm not sure if she was a survivor per se, but in that particular case, it was very document intensive, and having to review all of those documents with somebody who did not have the means to look at the data became very difficult. They spent hours just trying to figure out what platform they could use so that they could look at the same documents. And then even after all of the preparation for a Zoom hearing, technology failed on the day of the hearing. Luckily, this individual client was able to testify via telephone, and that worked out in that case very successfully. But again, those are issues that I know many of our clients with low income and maybe data plans that are not the best, and or family members in their home are going to have a really hard time to find the ability to do this remote hearing. And so I was listening to Dipke, and while she was talking, I was actually texting one of our managers going like, we need to set up a video conferencing room. That is a fantastic idea. So thank you for this forum, because we already got so many ideas just from listening from the other panelists today. So that's really, really important. Another issue that's come up that has been a huge challenge for domestic violence attorneys in the state of Texas is our hearings are all moving to Zoom hearings. And we, as victim advocates, have been really worried about the fact that in Texas, the open courts provision has been interpreted to say that the courts should live stream to a YouTube channel all the proceedings. And so we have heard, actually logged into a YouTube channel for certain courts and seen a victim testify. Some of those videos have stayed there for days. It's just, that's a new challenge that we need to let victims who want to seek protections of the court know that this is also going to be something that is possible. Obviously, we can file motions to close the courtroom, but not everybody, some of the victims may be applying pro se. Not all prosecutors who handle these are doing that, and private attorneys are also not choosing to do that in some of these situations. So we are hopeful. We've been talking to the Office of Court Administration and other legal aid providers so that we're all in the same page as we work with victims to secure that privacy. And I'm really hopeful that given some of our conversations and our advocacy with the Office of Court Administration, that new guidance will be issued to courts. As a funny note, I know maybe some of y'all have seen this, but there was over 2,000 viewers for an attorney fee dispute for a case out of Houston, Texas. So it's really scary. And so that's an issue that we're still struggling with, and we're looking forward to maybe a resolution that comes promptly. Again, working in silos is sometimes an issue. Luckily, we've been able to reach out to the Texas Council on Family Violence and other providers to see what the Office of the Attorney General is doing. Often they are in charge of doing establishment hearings. So we as legal aid attorneys, if we know an applicant is a victim and they're safe and they have a protective order, we may refer them to the Office of the Attorney General to get their parentage established and get orders for custody set up. Well, at the beginning, they were not doing hearings. So those cases might have had a higher priority, but I've learned recently that they've started to do, and it just depends on the individual OAG courts, whether or not they're actually having hearings or postponing them until a later date. So really knowing what each jurisdiction is doing is going to be incredibly important as we continue to do this work on behalf of survivors. Silver linings, let's see. Some of the silver linings, I know I spoke to the 280th Court in Harris County in Houston. It is a protective order only court, and she's seen already some of these protective order hearings go through her courtroom. And on a silver lining, she said that the victims who were testifying remotely seemed to feel a lot safer, more confident, less scared of confronting their abuser. And she had already been speaking to advocates at the Houston Area Women's Center about the possibility of having that option for survivors who cannot go down into the courtroom, and just have a space. And one of the things that she was really happy about is we had been talking about it, and now we were forced to do this. And we know we can do this, and that might be something that may be a new avenue for survivors moving forward. Also, I think everybody has adapted so quickly, and that has been so encouraging, to see individuals. I mean, I know our office went from being an office where everybody came into work to immediately remotely over a weekend. And just the fact that we were able to move forward, was really, really encouraging. And just the people that continue to show up, who care about these issues and are doing everything to provide the services is very important. Again, we're bracing ourselves for many cases as this pandemic continues, and as our states begin to open up and victims start needing or coming out. We've seen very, very serious incidents of violence throughout the state, many deaths. Many of the cases that we are getting, not only are we getting more cases, the severity of the violence is much more impactful, and the issues are so much more urgent. So I know that it's going to be tough on all of our staff moving forward, as well as just we all need to take care of each other moving through this and learning from what works best.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria Carmen. That's the YouTube question in particular, I think is really a fascinating question. And I know states across the country are wrestling with the open courts requirements and how to deal with that. I have seen a number of places people basically just logging in and watching what's going on in court and for entertainment. And that seems like it raises some significant safety concerns.
Well, there's, that safety, children watching, colleagues, coworkers. It's once it's out there, you can't bring it back in. And that's a serious consideration for a survivor who's going to expose, that victimization and share information that, could put her in further danger. So it's a very serious issue. There is a federal statute, that prevents any kind of online sharing of victim identity, the registration of a protective order. So we are hopeful that the new guidelines will at least cover protective orders and make sure that all courts are aware of that. But until then, I don't know how many victims have actually had to testify and have their information out there.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Kelly, how about the far West Coast? What are we hearing out there?
West Coast. Hi, it's good to see you all, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. So I actually have more questions than answers at this point, but I was told that was okay. And some of these have already been touched upon, but I feel like they might be worth highlighting again. An attorney I spoke with this morning probably said it best when she said COVID-19 is exacerbating all of the issues that already exist in domestic violence cases. It's absolutely become another tool for abusers to use to control victims. And it's becoming yet another barrier for victims to seek help. Here in California, there's a ton of variance by county. It sounds like that's happening everywhere. In my county that I work in, primarily Yolo County, we are in week 6 of our shelter in place, and our physical courthouse is mostly closed except for a few criminal matters. They've deemed mid-March through mid-May to be court holidays. They reissued temporary restraining orders, continued them 45 days, and other matters have been continued out longer. We in this county don't yet have e-filing, but the judiciary moved really quickly and established a new email address for restraining orders and emergency family law matters. They're using conference calls to hear those emergency hearings, and there's actually a plan to move to Zoom next week. And I was so concerned when Maria Carmen talked about the YouTube channel, and then I popped on our court website last week, and it looks like we are now up and running on a YouTube channel as well for the criminal matters still being heard. I don't know what that means for family law yet, so that's something else that's still a question. They've been hosting weekly bench bar calls here with updates, which has been really amazing, and our family court facilitator is still fielding calls. So I feel like the judiciary has done as much as they can, but I have a lot of concerns, and one of my first concern is access. And I know David, DPT, and Maria Carmen all spoke about this briefly, but we used to run a weekly pro bono walk-in clinic, and a lot of the clients I met and that my students met us simply by walking into the courthouse, right? Running out of their jobs very quickly, trying to get some assistance with the forms. And I worry about how these victims are going to be able to access this. A lot of my clients rely primarily on their cell phones, and their cell phones are not going to let them complete 40-page restraining order application. They may or may not have a safe computer at home or stable internet. They may not have access to an interpreter. Their email may not be safe. They may not be able to connect as effectively with advocates and attorneys who aren't just standing in the courthouse when they walk in. And on the other end of the spectrum, I spoke to an attorney in LA yesterday who said that some of their courthouses are requiring victims to actually drop off the petitions physically in drop boxes. And so I'm wondering what's happening to victims who no longer have access to transportation, right? Through friends that may not feel safe taking them in their car, or technically aren't supposed to take them in their car. Public transit that has either been reduced or may be considered unsafe, and ride shares. I'm worried about enforcement. California has worked really hard to, at least some counties, reduce the jail and prison populations to avoid the rapid spread of COVID-19, which I think is absolutely something we have to do, right? but what impact does this have on domestic violence arrest and restraining order enforcement? And then also, is the VINE system keeping pace with releases? I've heard at least a couple of cases where that's not happening. You know, I spoke with an advocate whose client ran into her abuser, who had also been arrested for raping their child in Walmart, because apparently he had been released and she was completely unaware of that. And I'm wondering how often those sort of things are falling through the cracks. Another question I have that I don't have an answer for yet is, as we work to cease evictions, which again is absolutely the right thing to do, what, if any, impact is this having on the enforcement of the move-out provisions and restraining orders? I'm grateful that the courts are reissuing the temporary restraining orders, but in California, you can't get certain relief until you have a hearing, and that includes essentially all financial support. So I'm concerned that clients may be waiting 2-3 months for access to financial support that they actually need to be safe, perhaps now more than ever. And I'm really concerned about custody and visitation. I know Maria Carmen and Dipti mentioned this as well, but I'm very concerned about the kind of modifications that victim parents are being required to do through parenting plans in order to adjust to closed or unavailable resources. So schools, daycares, supervised visitation centers, professional supervisors, third parties, grandmas who previously conducted those exchanges, some of those public exchange locations, right? They're all gone. And I'm worried about how that implicates victim safety or the children's safety. I think back to many of the very detailed parenting plans that I've helped clients create in order to really emphasize, you know, their safety concerns. And now they're just all blown up. So the question is, are victims now being required to forego the protections and restraining orders in order to implement visitation? And that seems to be happening. A lot of victims with no contact orders are now being advised to supervise remote or even in-person visitation. And related to that, I'm concerned about the impact that our growing use of technology have on victim safety. You know, victims, like I said, who email and restraining orders, what if the other party has access to their email, which is not uncommon. Victim in a shelter who's now required to do a Zoom visit, even though the shelter forbids Zoom visits, right? What happens if that opens up the possibility to the abuser locating the shelter? I'm still a little unclear about what constitutes a custody or visitation emergency during a pandemic. In my county, I think they've been very generous about putting it out there that they're available to have these phone hearings, but they've seen a decrease in emergency cases. And I think that's because victims are very hesitant to call their attention to some of the issues happening. And this brings me to my really serious, very serious concern about this disconnect between, on one hand, this growing awareness of how shelter in place and financial and health stressors of COVID-19 really increases domestic violence. Like, I feel that conversation is happening. But on the other hand, there's this admonishment to co-parents that they have to work through this conflict on their own. You know, they need to be the grownups in the room. And there's a disconnect. You know, for example, AFCC and AAML released their 7 guidelines for parents sharing custody during the pandemic. A lot of courts have adopted this or put it on their website, and it focuses on co-parenting techniques. But it makes absolutely no mention of domestic violence or safety. And I certainly applaud their work as it applies to nonviolent parents, but I'm really concerned about parent victims of domestic violence who are getting the message that they have to ignore the dangers that their abusers pose to them in order to compromise during the time of crisis. And I think that only really serves to embolden abusers right now. I think somehow we've totally forgotten that victims who are separated from their abusers before the pandemic are also at an increased risk right now. You know, we've had this focus on emergency restraining orders, and that's good, but we've got people who separated before it. And I feel like our narrative about domestic violence has completely erased them, particularly if they're parents. And the last question I have is whether or not, what's going to happen when the courts open up again? We know that litigation abuse is a really common tactic utilized by abusers. So I absolutely know that I'm going to see some contempt petitions as soon as the courts open up again. But I have no idea how the courts are going to respond to that. So that's a concern I have. In terms of tips, I mean, my number one tip is the same always. It's safety planning. But I find that I'm having a safety plan in ways that I haven't had a safety plan with clients again. It's honestly brutal, right? It's more crucial than ever. And by that, I don't mean the checklist that you pull off the internet, but a very detailed plan that you help your client create in order to plan for the worst case scenarios. You know, what is your escape plan if he shows up at the house? What are you going to tell your children in that moment? How can you get help, and who can you get help from? One attorney I spoke with this week said at this point, she's just trying to help keep her client alive until the next hearing. And I've had similar thoughts with some of my cases. So please, please, please safety plan if you're working with victims in any capacity. Another tip that's already been mentioned is a communication and collaboration piece. I'm calling advocates on cell phones, and thank God I have their numbers and they are calling me, and those relationships are so important right now. If you don't already have those networks, I think now is a great time to create them. And the last tip is just creativity. And I've been amazed at some of the advocates and attorneys who've come up with these very, like, the cliched thinking outside the box, but thinking through these creative alternative options. If you can't put a child on a plane right now, but the court's going to require the child to visit dad, is there any other way to handle it? And one example I heard this morning is that, the attorney researched hotels in the community where mom is, and asked dad to go ahead and drive down, and figured out the one hotel that seems to be a safe space right now for him and the child to meet. So really trying to figure out how to do it. And that's some of the silver linings, right? Is that we adapt as we need to. Here, at least the temporary restraining orders are actually coming back much sooner than normal, because it's one of the only things the judges are doing. So that's an upside. I think the fact that our local government, judiciary are talking about domestic violence is a silver lining. I think the awareness is important. I dearly hope, Mary Carmen mentioned this as well, but I really hope that now that courts have had the opportunity to have hearings through the phone, and eventually through Zoom, that they'll consider allowing victims to do that in the future. And the last thing gets back to what the judge said, which is that I really hope this is an opportunity for courts to create right now a disaster plan for the next time this happens. Because she's right. And this is not just pandemics. This is hurricanes. This is, tornadoes. This is like a lot of different communities have lived through disruptions to their court systems. And I think now is a good time to make sure that courts absolutely include domestic violence, not just restraining orders, but domestic violence in custody cases into those disaster plans.
Kelly, that's awesome. Thank you very much for that. Rebecca, anything you want to add about the sort of on the national side or policy questions?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I've been listening with great interest to all of these sort of snapshots from around the country and from different perspectives and situations within the legal system. The work that we do at the Commission is about 2 steps removed from what people are doing really right on the front lines, working directly with clients. And so it's always helpful to us to be able to hear directly from folks who are having those one-on-one interactions and hearing about what the issues are. And then part of what we do is try to raise that up to a national sort of policy level, and try to work those stories and anecdotes and experiences into conversations with policymakers to try to identify solutions that can sort of then trickle back down. And to be honest, a lot of the solutions in this scenario are ones that need to be developed locally and controlled locally, and need to be very sort of grassroots or at least grass tops solutions for folks that are responsive to the issues that they're seeing, particularly in their own communities. But what can happen at the federal level is appropriations, is getting money to the field, and that has really been the primary focus of all of the federal response to the pandemic. And as I'm hearing about the issues that folks are describing, money doesn't solve all problems, but money can be really helpful in addressing a lot of these problems. And so I think the continued focus has got to be not just getting these emergency funds to people and to specifically to domestic violence service providers and to legal service providers to respond to the emergent crisis that's happening right now in the last 6 to 8 weeks and what will happen for the next 6 to 8 weeks, but also recognizing that there is going to be this sort of tidal wave, this tsunami of cases that's going to hit in 6 months or whenever it comes. We can't make a precise prediction, but we know that it's coming, and there needs to be planning and preparation for how to address that, and there needs to be funding for local programs to be able to address that. there need to be technology solutions that are more accessible, maybe public technology solutions that can be made available. Judge, I think it was you who talked about setting up rooms in the courthouse that would have, that would be, sort of safe, isolated rooms, but would also have computer access. So people could still technically go to court, assuming, as Kelly said, they can find transportation to get there, but then still have a remote access hearing from the courthouse. That's a great and innovative solution, but there have got to be other sorts of accessible technology solutions, and also safe and private technology solutions. I'm very concerned about this sort of instinctive embrace of technology that the nation is experiencing right now, which is great for so many situations, but I don't think that people are spending a lot of time thinking about the security of their Wi-Fi connection or the security of their platform, and whether or not people can be recording without the knowledge of other folks in the meeting or in the hearing. Or, I mean, I'm sure, I trust in American ingenuity for the fact that there will be lots of creative and innovative and insidious ways to hack technology solutions that get developed over the next 6 to 12 months for addressing some of these problems. And I also trust perversely that those hacking strategies will be utilized and deployed against survivors of gender-based violence. And so we need to be planning and preparing for that as well. There need to be things in the pipeline now for responding and combating that kind of misuse of technology that is already occurring, and I believe will continue to be refined as we go forward. The other thing I'll say is, David, I love hearing you talk about e-service. This is definitely a bias point for me, because I worked with some other advocates and some congressional staff members last year on developing a federal bill to provide funding through the Violence Against Women Act to pilot e-service for civil protection order cases in multiple jurisdictions around the country. And so that got introduced, and then, it never went anywhere because e-service for protection orders is not a really sexy legislative issue that lots of people want to jump on board with. And there's always something else that's more pressing. But that is something that people are thinking about at the federal level and trying to figure out. That was obviously way before this particular crisis, but just recognizing that we have access to technology tools that could be really useful and really helpful. And we need to be investing in developing those, both in the private sector, but also federally with federal dollars. And so that's really been the activity and the focus of advocates who are working at the national policy level, is trying to get those requests for funding packaged in the right way, framed so that the money flows in the right direction. I mean, there's so many technicalities about federal funding, but getting the attention of appropriators in the midst of everyone else who right now is trying to get the attention of appropriators for their particular issues, but really bringing this to the forefront and ensuring that it gets the attention that it deserves. I can say we've had four COVID relief packages now in the last about 6 weeks, I think, probably about 8 weeks. The first one had nothing to do with domestic or sexual violence. Excuse me. That was just about getting funding to the healthcare field. The second one, we had started pushing for some GBV, gender-based violence funding to get included there, but it just we didn't gain enough traction before the Families First Act, which was the second round of funding, got passed through. But there were a lot of things in that second round of funding that are really helpful for survivors, like access to paid leave, additional funding for food security and supports for all sorts of poverty assistance programs that are always going to be useful for a survivor population. The last round, the CARES Act, which was COVID-3, did include, I just want to mention, out of the $2.2 trillion that were appropriated for that program, and that included the cash payments to individuals, the stimulus package, and a lot of the stimulus payments to governments. It also included $45 million for the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which is shelter funding. That's where most domestic violence shelters get their funding. So there's an additional $45 million available for those folks. And there was $2 million thrown in for the National Domestic Violence Hotline because they've had to figure out how to move their very highly sophisticated, technologically complex, and super secure and private operation into people's homes so that everyone who works at the hotline can stay safe as well and be able to work at home. And the national hotline has also taken all of the local hotlines that have had to shut down because they don't have the capacity to manage working from home, roll their calls over to the national hotline. And so they've had incredible additional costs. The last thing I will mention on funding is the last round of funding. The CARES Act included $50 million for the Legal Services Corporation, which is great. That is the #1 case type for LSE funded organizations are family law cases, which we assume includes a significant percent of domestic violence cases. So that's valuable and important. The next round of funding is going to be COVID-4. We're hoping that's going to happen sometime in May, and there is a significant push, and I'm happy to announce some significant high-level interest in making sure that there is additional funding to the field, funneled primarily through Violence Against Women Act mechanisms, but getting more like a few $100 million to the field with not a lot of restrictions, with a lot of flexibility so that local communities can implement whatever programs are most useful. So if that sounds good to you, call your members of Congress and encourage them to get on board with COVID-4 and making sure that it includes that kind of funding for supports for survivors.
Rebecca, thank you so much for that. I would say, in addition to calling your representatives, what we're also hearing is that because of that funding, states are cutting their funding, and so make sure you're calling your local representatives as well, your local bar associations, to make sure that there's an advocacy toward making sure the state funding is maintained, because everyone's like, oh, the feds are paying for it, it's great.
Right.
Not the case. So just before we wrap up, I was wondering if people wanted to take like 30 seconds to answer a couple of questions that have been sort of out there that I'd love to hear. We have 4 minutes left, so I think we can do this. So we've covered a lot of ground, but what about agreement on remote hearings? Is that required? And what to do about that? Another one is, what are courts doing in terms of making sure that there's compliance with a batter's treatment as a condition of either parenting plan or in the criminal side? Are we seeing any of that? And the last question that I was hoping people might take a stab at is really, how do we do an intake with a survivor if in the home? How do you make that safe? So anyone want to take 30 seconds to take a shot at any of those? I throw that out there.
I can say with regard to agreements on hearings, our court orders say that protective orders are emergency hearings, and that they only become remote if both parties agree. And they just started, and our assumption is going forward, we're going to go in as if the abuser does not want to consent. And I think it was also sort of jokingly said, but I don't know, might have some teeth. knowing your user, because if they're trying to contradict sort of what you're saying, is this something you want to offer and in person, and they choose remote? and so we find that just in the few cases that we haven't had these issues successful. But I think sort of thinking about alternatives where it's just sort of the worst situation where they just want to do contrary to what you're doing, that type of thinking may be better. In terms of better intervention, our local jurisdictions sort of vary. And from when I last touched base with individuals, I think their programs were sort of, we have to work remotely. We have to kind of situate ourselves and stabilize. And so the hearings that we've had, that has not come into play because we've been able to resolve a lot of the cases. But I think the formal programming, we haven't seen that, and then that just may be based on what went into our office. As I mentioned, the survivor intake earlier, I think it's giving a code. As we were talking about intake questions, we suggested our intake say, advise the person to say if they feel uncomfortable answering or asking the question. Perhaps they could say, oh, thank you, let's move on, or just sort of give words that they can use during the intake to alert the listener that this is not safe.
Excellent. Thank you, DP. So I just want to wrap up with a couple different things. One is the problem of domestic violence obviously existed before COVID. We sometimes think pre and post COVID. It's going to continue. It's going to persist afterwards. We need to continue to support all our organizations that support and help survivors, donation advocacy. As Kelly said, safety planning, safety planning, safety planning. And we heard some really awesome lessons here and some really great silver linings, e-service, thinking about making sure that it's an option for folks to testify remotely. And some of the other things we were hearing, I think, are fabulous. And other things people can do, contact your state DV coalition, of course, and the task force. So we have two things from the ABA that I just want to direct you to. One here is the domestic and sexual violence website, and we have a bunch of COVID resources there. The other one is as President Perry Martinez mentioned earlier, the ABA, she set up a task force to deal with coronavirus and some of the legal issues stemming from that. One of the things that we're going to see rolled out in the next week is from the Young Lawyers Division in combination with an organization called Paladin, which will be a pro bono platform. And so please look for that. That will be really exciting and a way for people to get involved. The task force has lots of resources on there as well. And I want to say just thank you so much to our panelists. I really appreciate the variety of perspectives and the insight into what's happening and really the big picture all across the country. So I really appreciate that. Fabulous. And you're doing really critical work, and we thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to share that with us today. Please make sure to check in to to aba.org, the commission, and the ABA website in general. And thank you to the section on civil rights and social justice, the Judicial Division, and the commission for putting this on. Best of luck to everyone. Please stay safe, and thanks for everything you do.